Hi, I'm Ali Words, and this is Last Unrifled Yaw. Last Unrifled Yaw is a podcast where we have conversations about video art, experimental music, avant-garde literature, performance art, and the occult. If you or someone you know would like to be on Last Unrifled Yaw, please get in touch. Brett Carson is a composer creating experimental opera with occult themes. We also talk a lot about surrealism, Gnosticism, and unusual musical meter. Hey everyone, I am Ali Words, and today we have Brett Carson. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself, Brett?
Sure. I am a composer, pianist, improviser, poet, sometimes theater artist based in the San Francisco Bay Area. My work deals predominantly with the kind of invention of imagined worlds and mythologies and kind of articulating these through pieces. Stylistically, I'm pretty eclectic. I like a lot of different music, and it kind of comes out in my work. But I guess the basis of my work is, I guess, the classical tradition with a lot of jazz on the side.
Awesome. So what got you into pursuing this to such a degree?
Pursuing music or pursuing the kind of work specifically that I do?
I think the second question is more interesting.
Okay. So I was raised a Christian. I think I was given, I think when you grow up in a religious situation, you have, you sort of grow up with a religious feeling, religious interest in those kinds of things. And I have all of this baggage that is the knowledge of the Bible it's nice to do something with that, I think, instead of just throw it away.
Yeah.
So I was really interested in kind of exploring all of that and things adjacent to that. So I was raised as an evangelical Christian, as a Southern Baptist, actually, but was pretty dissatisfied with it, I think, from the beginning of when I began to really think about these things. And so I did a lot of exploration in my late teens and college years into Christian adjacent things like Catholicism is Christianity, evangelical adjacent things like Catholicism. But also things like Gnosticism, and even dabbled a little bit in Thelema, not a huge amount, but in those kinds of things, got really into Carl Jung and all these kinds of things. I think for me, what it really comes down to is that I have pretty broad interests, and I'm pretty restless in that I don't really want to just do one thing. So I want to create an artwork that encapsulates a lot of different things, ideas and traditions and types of knowledge and things like that.
Yeah, I'm on the same page. I want to integrate everything I can.
Mm-hmm.
So it's exciting to talk to someone else with a similar approach to creativity. How do you go about, what is the process like of, let's say, beginning one of these heavily interdisciplinary projects like for you? And it might be easier if we talked about a specific one, unless you have like a grand theory, but Abraxas and Paramecium are two of your more recent works that might help ground the conversation.
Sure. I can talk about Abraxas. I think that's it's fresh in my mind, so it seems like a good thing to start with. You come up with a concept first. Sometimes it's as simple as like a sentence or something that seems appealing to me, or just some kind of simple conceptual framework. Sometimes it's a musical thing. With Abraxas, it was kind of two things. I wanted to write another opera, and I wanted it to have a string quartet with drums, because that's the thing that I feel like would work really well, but I hadn't really seen it very much. And then simultaneously, I had this concept that I got from Carl Jung's Seven Sermons to the Dead, where he's talking about Abraxas is the Lord of the Toads and Frogs. And I just thought that was a cool line. At the time, I didn't really know what it meant, but it was an interesting enough line that I kind of wanted to follow it and see where it led me. And so that was the starting point. And then you have to do things like finding musicians, finding funding, which is maybe not very exciting to talk about, but it's kind of part of it. So once all that was in place, I started kind of investigating the potential within that sentence. Abraxas is the lord of the toads and frogs. I knew that Carl Jung was referencing some kind of god from Gnosticism that I later kind of come to find out was from a system of Gnosticism by Basilides of Alexandria. And Jung actually attributes Seven Sermons of the Dead to Basilides, even though he obviously wrote it and channeled it, if you think that's what happened. So I did a little research into Basilides, and then did a little more research into Gnosticism more broadly. As I continued to research, it gets more and more vast, and I'm reading more and more sources. Eventually reading a whole lot of the Nag Hammadi scriptures, like a bunch of them, which is kind of the modern, a lot of the modern corpus of Gnostic scripture is the Nag Hammadi scriptures. So I did a lot of research into that, took a lot of notes, also did some research into frogs, because I like this idea of combining two things that maybe shouldn't go together. In this particular instance, frogs and Gnosticism.
And also, land and terrestrial, aquatic and terrestrial life. It's very deeply involved.
Yeah, so that's kind of sort of what Jung brought to the table, was that Abraxas is this entity that's both of two opposites kind of coexisting in one entity. So good and evil, light and dark, land and water, night and day, etc. And so, that was obviously what he was referencing with amphibians being these beings of a dual nature. And so, reading all these Nag Hammadi texts, reading Jung and thinking about this idea of the dual nature, and it kind of leads me to sort of what I wanted the libretto to be roughly about. When I write libretti, if you will, I don't really think of a story. I'm not really very interested in narrative in opera. I don't think narrative is a necessary component of opera. So a lot of my operas are non-narrative and kind of abstract. So the way that I usually write is I think of concepts under the umbrella of the main concept, and then I kind of riff on them through automatic writing, which is the way that I've done this for, 15 years or something. Really interested in automatic writing as a path to lead me to these new ideas and these new revelations and things. So the libretto for Abraxas is mostly automatic writing. Some of it is me just restating the Gnostic or the Christian myths. And some of it is direct quotation from Nag Hammadi scriptures and from the Greek magical papyri. So I write this. It takes me a few months. I have this large body of text that I then have to edit into something resembling a libretto. Once I've figured out exactly how many scenes I'm going to have and kind of where the text should go within the piece, then I can begin writing music. And that comes down to, usually what I'll do is I'll listen to a bunch of pieces that have a similar instrumentation to my piece. So I listened to a bunch of string quartets, a bunch of Beethoven string quartets, Mozart string quartets, Schubert, all sorts of things, a lot of contemporary string quartets, and then a lot of drum percussion things, particularly looking for things that are for string quartet and percussion, which is actually kind of a hard thing to find. But once I worked through a lot of this repertoire, took a lot of notes of the kind of sounds I wanted in the piece. And then also the voice, of course, because there's voices in this piece as well, studying songs and other operas and things like that. Then I begin writing, usually starting with the movement that I feel like is going to be the hardest first, purely practically, so that I can get the music to the musicians for that movement as early as possible. And then working from there, and then once I've got the whole thing written and sent to everyone, we begin the rehearsal process, which lasts a couple of weeks, and then we do it. We hit it.
Yeah, that's awesome. That was a good overview of the whole thing, man. So, how much editing do you do? So, do you think it's your initial semi-automatic text? A lot of it is automatic writing, but then it sounds like there were selections, like I think Thunder Perfect Mind was in there, if I got that one right.
Right. Yeah. So like that one obviously was not my own text. It's a pretty straight adaptation of the Gnostic text, if it is Gnostic, but the Nag Hammadi text, Thunder Perfect Mind, which is one of the more interesting texts in the Nag Hammadi corpus.
So,
Yeah,
you can keep going. I was curious about your editing process. Like, how do you decide which things are right for a libretto?
Yeah, so with Thunder Perfect Mind, I just adapted it so that it was singable better. So I adapted it so that the meter felt better to sing and things like that. Some of the text I directly pulled from Nag Hammadi. In terms of my own automatic writing, I try to write, when I'm writing librettos, I try to write it in meter, because I find that meter is easier to sing and easier to set to music. It just sounds better set to music than like free verse.
Yeah.
So a lot of this stuff involved me, normalizing the meters if they weren't normalized, and editing things so they made more sense. Because sometimes with automatic writing, you get things that are complete gibberish, and maybe you want them to make more sense. Maybe you don't. Maybe you do. But so yeah, it was sort of like just kind of hewing the words into the direction that I wanted, because very rarely do I just do automatic writing and leave it at that. I find that the result of that is not really what I want. I did that for a long time, but as I write more and get older, like I want to say something a little bit more. Like I, meaning the ego, I want to say something.
Yeah.
And just to kind of make it flow better and give like a kind of psychological, emotional arc to the piece. I think it's important to kind of push words around a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I find that things like cut ups or automatic writing, or even AI generated text, depending on exactly how you're doing it, they give you like good, like clay, like raw material that you can manipulate. But usually they're not that great on their own.
Totally. Well, like the philosophy that I have, I'm kind of coming from two places. One of them is the theater artist Richard Foreman, who I'm a big fan of. I don't know if you know of him.
I don't, or maybe I'm drawing a blank, but I don't think so.
He's based in New York. He's retired now, I think. But he, this is sort of the way he makes texts, and I had read that he had done it this way. He does a lot of experimental kind of non-narrative theater, and he likes to write his own scripts, but they're incredibly abstract. And the way he puts them together is through automatic writing that is then edited. So that's kind of one side of it. The other side is a musical inspiration from the composer Yanis Xenakis, who's a big favorite of mine. And that's sort of the way that Xenakis would work, is he would have systems, but then if he didn't like what the system gave him, he would just move things around and change it. So he was not a purist at all. And I'm anything but a purist when it comes to this stuff. So, you just kind of do what needs to be done to get the result that you want,
Yeah, I think that lack of purity, in a positive connotation, it makes your operatic works a lot more dynamic emotionally than some other things. Like I find that a lot of opera, even opera that I enjoy, they tend to like settle into a fairly narrow like compositional range of like, these are the techniques we're using, these are the kinds of tonality or colors, whatever, and then it kind of tends to stay there. Whereas yours, like there were parts that went like in your Paramecium, the COVID-19 section was like a noise piece almost, right? So like you got a lot more variety than you would if you were to stick purely to like, here are the formal systems I decided on the beginning and I am following through to completion.
Yeah, I use whatever I need to use. I'm a pragmatist, both musically and probably philosophically also. But whatever works is the correct answer. So I like a lot of types of music. So within Secret Life of the Paramecium, what you're talking about, that piece is maybe too broad for my taste stylistically. I think I went a little too broad. But yeah, it covers a huge amount of territory musically.
It does make sense for it to be broad, because for listeners, And you could probably do a better pitch, but it follows the major arcana, right? And
That's correct. Yeah.
those are all symbolically, they're like really different vibes. There's a big difference between what the Lovers card means and the Tower, and you can hear it in the music.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, it works out, which is good. But at the end of the day, it really comes down to just the fact that I have very eclectic tastes. I could see another composer dealing with the subject matter in a way where there's variation, but maybe not quite as wide of variation is what I brought to it. Because with that piece in particular, with that piece, I was working with classical players, but then some of the musicians are also like jazz players and improvisers. I wanted to do a big electronic component for that piece. So there are like noise movements. There's movements that are, kind of adjacent to Vangelis, however you say his name, that sort of thing. So with that particular piece, yeah, the subject matter of the major arcana kind of lend itself to that kind of eclecticism, I think, more so than Abraxas.
Yeah. So if a listener were to really get engaged with Abraxas, what would you want them to experience from it? What kind of impression do you want to leave on people?
I don't know. I do all this talk of wanting to say something, but I think at the end of the day, I'm really curious and interested in people bringing their own interpretations to things. It's interesting talking to people afterward, and some of the things that people were noticing were things I intended, and some of the things were completely not things that I intended. And I find that to be like really interesting because, if you're using automatic writing, you're kind of relinquishing some control. And there's things that are mysterious within it. And, and some of my compositional process musically involves the musical equivalent of automatic writing, where I'm kind of improvising things, or, maybe you come back to it later and you see things in it that you didn't intend. And I think that's really valuable and interesting, which is, I think, one of the reasons I don't want to focus on narrative theater. Because with narrative theater, you're kind of going down one road, and that's kind of the road. And, maybe you see different things as you're going down that road, but it's one road. Whereas I think with non-narrative theater, it's kind of, to borrow a Deleuzian idea, it's kind of more rhizomatic. You're navigating from place to place in the way that you want to navigate. And you're kind of noticing what you want to notice, which could potentially lead you down a different kind of path in terms of your understanding of what the piece is. So I would say there is a meaning to Abraxas. But I think if you are listening to it or watching it and you don't get that meaning, that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And even just like the basic concept of Abraxas, okay, I should say my interpretation of Abraxas. The Abraxas that can be named is not the true Abraxas. But yeah, it makes sense that you shouldn't really say entirely what it is, because no matter what you say, it's not going to fully encapsulate like a non-dual understanding of whatever it is you want to point at with the word Abraxas.
Yeah. And, my favorite pieces of music, or pieces of art generally, are pieces that kind of defy a clean interpretation. I think if you see a thing or hear a thing and are able to immediately, clearly, succinctly summarize it, it's not succeeding on some level. I think it should be messy and it should be complicated, and the meaning should shift over time as you listen to it multiple times. And
absolutely. Yeah, go ahead.
So subject matter like Abraxas, or even like their major arcana, are things that shift in relation to your own place or your own way of listening, or your own mindset in listening, or something like that. So I think that's why I'm attracted to those kind of subjects, is they lead to a lot of ambiguity.
Definitely, yeah. And I was just going to echo with Deleuze and Guattari's A Thousand Plateaus. The book is structured as like a strange meaning-making machine rather than a single message that it's supposed to grant you.
Yeah, and it does seem to me, at least, that I don't know what a lot of that book means. I get the feeling after reading, 20 pages or something that I haven't comprehended really what's been said. But I think that's part of the point. Like you say, the language kind of, it's reflective on some level. You can kind of read what you want into a lot of it.
Yeah, the way I use Deleuze, and I use Deleuze a lot, is I treat them as meaning making machines, as in these are words that sure, the author might be dead, and I'm not necessarily interpreting the same thing that they had in mind when they were writing it, but it's just like a linguistic tool that causes me to create other sequences of words that are hopefully beautiful or useful or something, And Deleuze does that for me, at least within my own practice.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to read Deleuze. I think it's a good way to read a lot of experimental poetry and literature. Like Finnegan's Wake is another example of something that I think can really lead you kind of wherever you want it to lead you. Because, you get the feeling with Finnegan's Wake that it is intended to mean something.
Yeah, I've read the whole thing, actually. I love that.
Oh, man. Oh, no. I've read the first 100 pages multiple times.
Fair. That's probably almost as good.
I think I've always felt like Finnegan's Wake would be great if each page was released as its own separate work.
It was for a long time called Work in Progress and released in little chunks. It
was really serially, yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's the way to kind of read Joyce in general. I would say this about Ulysses also. Speaking as someone who hasn't completed either of those books, I think for me, I get a lot more out of poetry, like smaller chunks of that kind of language. So, like experimental poetry, like the poetry of Clark Coolidge in particular is somebody I really like. In my opinion, the greatest living poet. Which is, it's kind of what you're saying. You can just kind of write it how you want. Like you're riding a wave. You can just sort of write it how you want. You don't really have to look for his meaning, which I think can be really liberating. It's nice to look for the meaning of the poet, but it's also nice to kind of find your own meaning within things.
Definitely. What I always find exciting, and it's part of why I like to ask artists about their process, is so if we take Finnegan's Wake, you're definitely intended, the intention of Joyce is that you find meanings that he wasn't even intending because of how he layered on so much language.
Right.
But understanding his meta intention and the way he started out with an initial text that was mostly English and just kept on layering in puns from different languages, it helps you show a process of meaning making rather than a single meaning.
Right. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, I like that.
So, what do you like to do in terms of rhythm and meter? I'm not necessarily the best at hearing exactly what's going on with meter, but I always like experimentation with that kind. And I felt like sometimes I was hearing that in your work, or maybe just shifting emphasis on specific beats.
Okay. So I come from a jazz background. I think at the end of the day, groove is kind of important to me. So things tend to groove in my music. They tend to snap to a grid in a way that they don't necessarily with a lot of contemporary classical music. Let me be clear what I'm saying here. I think what I'm saying is there's a pocket that you can find in the sense that, there's a groove. A lot of contemporary classical music is concerned with kind of sounds and space. So the function of rhythm is to position a sound in space in a really particular location. And there's some of that happening in Abraxas, but I would say mostly I'm concerned with a grid or with a groove. And then obfuscating the groove. Because I don't want it to just be the same. I want something to happen that kind of trips you a little bit. So I'm doing that a few times. I'm doing with metric modulation, which would be where you take one note value that then becomes the new beat. So you take something that isn't the beat that then becomes the beat. So there's this feeling of, being jerked around into a new kind of tempo or metric situation. I use on one occasion near the end of Abraxas something called irrational meters. So let me
Like
see.
irrational numbers, like pi or e?
No, it's not really the
Okay.
same thing. So time signatures have a multiple of 4 or 2 rather on the bottom, like a power of 2. So you're going to
Okay.
see 2, 4, 8, 16, things like that.
So for listeners, that's like normal music, except for like a waltz, which is 3.
Well, a waltz would still have 4 on the bottom.
Oh
So
yeah, sorry, on the bottom. You're right.
yeah, so in terms of the number of beats per measure, that's kind of a different
I
component.
see. I got you.
What I'm interested in is putting a number on the bottom that is not a multiple or is not a power of 2. So
Okay.
within the end of Abraxas, I actually have a 4/6 measure, which I'll briefly describe. I don't want to get too in the weeds. Usually you would have something like the quarter note would be the beat. In this particular instance, the quarter note triplet becomes the beat. So you would have 4 quarter note triplets in a measure, which gives the impression of tripping almost. When you're listening to it, it feels as if everything's cruising along and then you trip. And then something odd happens and then you're back.
Yeah, there were a few times. I don't know if this is the same moments where I could hear, like, especially with the singers, if you're paying attention, it seems like sometimes they like pause for a little bit. Like when they say the next word, it's definitely where it's supposed to be, but there's like a slightly odd rest.
Yeah, sometimes I'll add in a little unit of time just to kind of, I mean, there's a lot of ways to do what I'm describing to kind of obfuscate the groove. But yeah, that happens quite a lot also. And I think that's more interesting than just listening to a repeating exact rhythm.
Definitely.
Hopefully I explained that in a way that was somewhat clear.
Yeah, I don't know who said it, but I I fairly often okay, so I think there's no known original attribution for this, but someone originally said that writing about music is like dancing about architecture.
Yeah, I heard that was Frank Zappa.
I've seen older suggested sources, but yeah, many people have said it, and it has a kernel of truth for sure.
Yeah, and it's like any of those things. Like, who knows who said them? But yeah, no, I agree with that 100%. Yeah,
cool.
But then I also teach music for a living, so I really should be able to explain things.
Yeah. Well, it depends on your audience. Like,
that's
teaching
true. Yeah.
music theory about like experimental opera to like random podcast listeners, you can't even see their faces. That's way harder than helping some people who have been, playing an instrument, even if it's just for a year.
Sure. Yeah.
Cool. Would you like to touch on your experience with constructed languages?
Yeah, I don't have a huge amount of experience with it, but I did invent a language for a project from a number of years ago called Mysterious Descent, which is probably the first project where I invented a mythology to kind of accompany it also. And it seemed appropriate to simultaneously invent a language. So yeah, I invented a language called Coctimo that I was in this kind of phase where I was really influenced by Borges, the writer Jorge Luis Borges, where I kind of wanted to make things and sort of pass them off as actual true things, but they are something that I made up. And so at the time, that was kind of what I did. I invented a language in this whole culture and civilization with its own religious system, and then tried to pass it off as being an actual culture that existed historically. I mean, I think with that, the way that I did it, it was a long time ago, but if I'm remembering right, the way that I did it was I first picked sounds. So you got to have to start with your sounds first. A lot of the
phonetics
sounds
of the language, right?
Yeah, the phonetic sounds of the language. I started with the IPA, the International Phonetic Alphabet.
Okay.
I picked a lot of sounds that from like Slavic languages. I was really interested in the sounds of languages like that. And then I came up with a grammar, came up with the way the order of words and sentences and things like that, and then invented ultimately an alphabet for that, which you can find on the cover of that album, the Mysterious Descent album. There's actually a drawing that I did that sort of diagrams the mythology, but also involves a lot of the writing from that language.
Yeah, I was listening to a little bit of that right before we started, and I was wondering, like, I had assumed that that was the language, and so it kind of looks like an elephant, right? And that's relevant.
You
I
got
think.
it.
Okay,
Yep.
but I remember maybe it'd be interesting to hear, but like, so just looking at it, I see that there are these. They could be glyphs. They could be actual like characters from a language, like glyphs being like sigils that maybe are more symbolic meaning, but it looks like they're placed in like along the eyes and like sinuses and then like up through the mouth. Is that like a sun and a moon right below the, I don't know. And then you got the light dusk and the dark tusk.
I would need to look at the drawing. I haven't seen it in a while. I think you're right though. Yeah. So so at the time I had invented a pretty simple mythological kind of thing, 4 entities that were all elephants. So kind of 4 elephant gods, kind of roughly corresponding to the 4 classical elements. And then within that system, there was a goddess of wisdom and kind of a god of light and darkness, and then like a transcendent creator god. And so I invented names for all of them, and they each have their own symbol. And all that is on the front of that album. I wish I could remember the details of this more. This was a long time ago.
No, it's
it was
fine.
really...
Yeah, I think, 2017 it looks like.
Yeah.
And we're in 2024 right now. So yeah, I could not tell you exactly how I did things, 7 years ago. Especially like weird idiosyncratic details.
It's very detailed too. I was currently not when I did that. I started developing the mythology when I was in grad school at Mills College in Oakland, California. And Mills is, for those who know, is a very experimental music program. So my thesis advisor, Zena Parkins, who is an amazing composer, by the way, should check out her work. Zena encouraged me to write my thesis in a really, really idiosyncratic way. So the way that I wrote my thesis was the first half of it was a fictitious biography of myself, basically, written from the perspective of a musicologist. And then the second half is a short story about an archaeologist discovering this elephant temple in the woods. And so for part of that, I had invented all of this very detailed, tables of correspondence and things like that, different symbols and this whole like story and all of this. So yeah, it's a very detailed thing. There's a lot of components to it that I don't really remember.
Really, really cool though. It's worth a listen if you like. For the listeners, if you like. Experimental. It's a little bit more harsh or dissonant than a lot of things. Maybe not the entire time, and like some spoken word elements. It's parts of it are in English too, so like you can still like get a lot of the basic ideas. But if you like that kind of music, it's definitely worth a listen.
No, thanks. Yeah, and of course the text was written very similarly to kind of what I've been talking about. Like that's been my process for a long time. The added wrinkle, of course, being writing poetry in an invented language. Which is pretty hard to do.
Yeah, it depends on your grammar. So like I have a constructed language Vibebox that I use for approximately similar kinds of things, but it's polysynthetic. So I can easily, every unit of meaning ultimately turns into a single syllable. So I can basically make words any number of syllables I want. Rhyming is annoying, I guess, because the ending consonant, like the suffix of each syllable, determines a component of its meaning.
Yeah, that's kind of my language too. There were like little suffixes that tended to be the same at the end of sentences that made rhyming really difficult. I don't even remember if I did rhyme in my poetry, but it's definitely in a meter.
Yeah. What it does do that's interesting is you can, at least in Vibebox, so let's just say that you have a sentence, right? You could construct another sentence where every syllable ends in the exact same consonant. But there are different, I call them root words that attach to the front of the syllable. So you can get like infinitely long sort of rhymes, like every syllable
Hmm.
Yeah, so there are definitely different poetic devices that are available depending on how you construct your constructed language.
Right. And I haven't used that language in a long time because it had some shortcomings, I thought. In terms of the way it sounded, in terms of the way it formed a meaning, I'm probably going to invent another one. The plan is maybe to do that and write another opera, mostly or entirely in a new language.
That would be
But
awesome.
because I had some issues with the language, yeah, I think it's pretty good, but it
I
could be
liked
better.
it. I will
Oh,
say
thanks.
if you can before you make the language, if you can just write some sentences that don't have meaning but sound exactly the way you want,
Hmm.
you can then like reverse engineer a grammar and whatever your basis is for assigning meaning to morphemes or whatever. You can reverse engineer a language that'll sound like your gibberish text.
Yeah, that's actually what I did for Cocteau.
Oh, okay.
I invented the names of the four elephants first, and then each of their names is like a sentence, is a phrase.
Ah,
And so
okay.
then I reverse engineered it into the language. So yeah, I actually did that for this one.
Cool. I guess you've developed you've grown in your idea of what you would want it to do for a larger project.
Yeah, I saw kind of what it couldn't do, and I want to build one that can do that, both in terms of the language as a spoken language, but also the alphabet. I've had some ideas since then in terms of the way I want to construct the writing system.
What do you think about what are your thoughts on writing systems?
Um, I think uh, I think for this one I would want to do a syllabary. I've been wanting to do that because which would be where each syllable has its own character. I think that would also change the nature of the language too if you start from a syllabary. But
You know,
what do I think about writing systems?
I will say that's what I did, but then I most of the time I ended up typing the romanization, like the English characters version of it anyways.
Right, same. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. There's a romanization of my language too. I mean, because I don't want my poor singer David Katz, who's amazing, who I've worked with a lot, who sings on that album. I wouldn't want him to have to learn my alphabet.
Oh, well, it's not authentic unless you're looking at the actual glyphs while you sing them, right?
I beg to differ.
Yeah, that would be horrible.
Yeah, that's logistically, if you're going to be practical,
Yeah, I
it's
don't even
too
do
much.
that.
Yeah, it's mostly for me, for my aesthetic pleasure.
Hmm. You were going to say something, though, I thought.
Was I? I don't
That's
remember.
okay. Something about writing systems. If it comes back to you, that is cool.
Okay.
Uh, let's see. Do you have any like specific inspiration sources that you haven't mentioned already that you'd like to talk about?
Um, hmm.
If not, it's okay.
I mean, I could always talk about myself. I mean, I haven't really talked
Yeah,
a lot about my musical inspirations.
yeah. This is about you.
As I am a musician, I guess I should talk about that. Like, I think for me, musically, I don't know if you're familiar with any of these people. I'll just list off some names. I think for me, the most important composer is Olivier Messiaen, the French 20th
Yes.
century composer. A lot of his work, or a lot of my influence, comes from him. He actually wrote a book called Technique of My Musical Language, where he specifically spells out his compositional techniques, and they're pretty idiosyncratic techniques within 20th century music. So that was like my composition manual. So Messiaen is a big one for me. I'm a big fan of the work of Sun Ra, the jazz musician Sun Ra.
Yeah. The orchestra.
Oh yeah, I'm actually playing a gig in 2 weeks of Sun Ra's music in Berkeley.
That is awesome.
So he's a big one for me. Big fan of John Cage. A
Hmm.
big fan of Captain Beefheart.
Of course,
I really like the early Philip Glass music. I think that
but
stuff's really good.
not later Philip Glass. How do you feel
Well,
about Philip Glass's operas?
I think his trilogy of operas, like the OG trilogy, which would be Einstein, Satyagraha, and Akhenaten,
Hmm.
and I've seen all of them, which is I feel a privilege to have seen all of them. I think that trilogy is my blueprint for what I'm doing.
Yeah, I was
But
wondering. I heard some like slight maybe it was the way that you were varying your obscuring your grid or your pocket, your groove, that reminded me a little bit of some of his more extended weird rhythmic stuff he does, but like different. It was just like, oh, that's vaguely similar.
yeah, no, you're onto something because Philip Glass and Messiaen both were influenced in different ways by Indian classical music.
Oh yeah.
And I think
John
one
Cage
of,
too, right?
to a point, I think John Cage, it might have been a little more superficial.
Hmm.
He was influenced by Indian aesthetics, apparently. I don't really actually know a whole lot about it. I know with Cage, there was a lot of influence from Zen Buddhism, or at least Zen Buddhism as filtered through D.T. Suzuki.
Yeah.
But with Cage and Glass, I think the big takeaway for not Cage and Glass, sorry, Messiaen and Glass. The big takeaway for the two of them was this idea of additive rhythm. So rhythm built from the accumulation of small values instead of from a meter that is then divided into smaller values. So it would be additive rhythm instead of, subtractive, divided rhythm, divisive rhythm.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a thing that really gives Glass that feeling of, these phrases, every time you hear them, get a little longer, or there's one additional note. With Messiaen, his note values get slightly longer every time because he's adding another 30-second note or something like that. That particular rhythmic concept has been a huge influence on me. That's kind of the way I think about rhythm.
There's something I've always wanted to do with that has never worked for me. So anyone who hears this is welcome to steal it. But the idea was to do that and then at the same time do that in terms of the tonality. So like to give an example that would work just like on a regular piano, the difference between like whole tone and then like skipping additional beats or going back to chromatic, but like literally stretching and pulling apart the notes in an additive way, like the scale, I guess, the tonality, or I do a lot of microtonal stuff. So it would be, now we're in 13 tones per octave, 14, 15 as but it never sounded good in any way that I did it. So
yeah, that's interesting. So what you're saying is each small rhythmic value be equivalent to like a half step, for example. So 3 16th notes together would be a minor third, 3 half steps big, or something like that. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it could be. Like if
obviously,
you were just,
I mean, I'm not talking microtonally right now, obviously, but
yeah,
like
and then you could expand it so that now instead of half steps, they're whole steps, or now they're doing minor thirds or fourths, fifths, whatever. And you could, especially if you had like the Philip Glass repeating arpeggio thing, it occurred to me that there might be a way that if someone had the right intuition or mathematical theory, that you could have these like expanding and contracting tonalities at the same time juxtaposed with the expanding and contracting meters in a way that would sound good. I just never succeeded. So the idea is out there.
I know American composer Henry Cowell had some ideas in terms of relating what did he do? I think it was notes of the overtone spectrum to divisions of the beat. So for example, like the third overtone would correspond to a triplet. The fourth overtone would correspond to 16th notes. The fifth would correspond to quintuplets. I think that was an idea that he had, which is a little different from what you're describing, but
it's related. Yeah.
There is he draws a relationship between the rhythmic subdivision and the overtone that we're talking about.
Yeah. Because like on a really tiny, like microscopic level, like in the hertz, they are rhythms.
They are the same thing. Ultimately, they are the same thing, even though you can't hear them as the same thing.
Cool. Do you have any questions or topics that you'd like to dig into?
I think I saw something about surrealism in your bio, I believe. Am I right about
that? I am heavily influenced by the surrealists. I don't know if it's in my bio, but yeah, I mean, it's been a long time since I read the surrealist manifestos, but I have, right? I was really into them when I was back in college.
Same.
Yeah, and I did write a book about the Situationists. The Situationists, for listeners, they're not exactly the surrealists, but they're doing similar stuff, similar time period. I think the Situationists are a little later.
I think they're later, yeah.
Yeah. But they had this concept of the derive, where you like wander basically through the world. It's like automatic walking, but if you've heard the term psychogeography, you like pay attention to the way geography and especially architecture and city planning influence you psychologically, and then allow yourself to like move through these spaces, especially man-made spaces, but you can do it in nature too, in ways that are atypical and expose you to like even just like your same local environment in new ways that are enlivening. It's like taking automatic walking or automatic writing and it's like treating the whole world as like an art installation. And hopefully you don't get charged with being a public nuisance.
Right. Well, if you do, that's part of the artwork.
Yeah, I'm still performing, right?
Your arrest is another journey into a new place.
Yeah, is it called The Living Theater? Someone did that. I was reading this book called Paradise Now.
Okay.
They did something like that. They were performance art types, and they stayed in the theater until the police forcibly removed them, and they kept the act going in prison for a while. Yeah.
Oh, the 20th century. What a utopia. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I've never heard of that before. I'm not super familiar with the Situationists. Surrealism was a big influence for me, in particular the poetry, surrealist poetry. The painting and filmmaking also, but people like Andre Breton was a really important early influence on me. And of course, he was super into seances and things like that too.
Yeah, of course. I really appreciated how they were doing basically the occult thing, but they framed it in almost a secular way. A lot of them. I mean, some of them were theosophists or whatever, or also doing thelema, but some of them were basically like, yeah, this is Freudian, whatever. And that was the system they were sticking to. Yeah.
No, I really am inspired by that. This kind of, because a lot of them were atheists, I know, and they were very secular in some ways, but then also were doing these like spiritualist things. It's almost like kind of an aestheticized thing, which I can relate to too, because for me, any kind of influence of the occult is an aesthetic influence primarily. I'm not really a practitioner of the occult. So I'm influenced aesthetically by a lot of it. I know I read a book about the influence of alchemy on the work of Max Ernst. It was a really interesting book. I forget the name of that book. But because Max Ernst is, I think, one of the most potent of the surrealist painters in terms of really getting to this weird, uncanny place with his work. In this kind of symbolic reading of alchemy that was really fashionable in the early 20th century. But yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. But about the surrealists, yeah, I guess that's the main thing is I really liked, I part of me still, the teenage alley or whatever is still sad that surrealism didn't pan out politically.
Right. No, like it was a total failure, I think.
Yeah, for people who don't know, though, they early on they thought of themselves as like a political movement, and then weird stuff happened with a lot of them went aligned themselves with communism, and then history. But yeah, it didn't unleash the self-actualized subconscious total humans of everyone who looked at a Dali painting to overthrow capitalism.
Right. Well, I mean, Dali was basically a fascist.
Yeah. He had those like Hitler masturbating paintings.
I haven't seen that.
Yeah, there are a couple of them. Yeah, I guess I'm playing devil's advocate, but so I believe Dali was a fascist. He wrote a novel that wasn't very good, but anyways,
what's his novel?
I forget the name of it because it wasn't good. The book he wrote that I actually enjoyed was like 100 Secrets of Magic Painting or whatever, something along those lines, and it's entertaining. But
his
the novel,
his autobiography is fantastic. I think I'm a big fan of his autobiography.
I have not read them. He has a cookbook too.
Oh God,
the cookbook is fun. I was a little disappointed that the recipes weren't more surreal. Like a lot of it is food that like he actually made that was like basically French cuisine, but a little weird.
Right.
But like some of the like blurbs of like impossible recipes at the beginning of the chapters are cool. And I was hoping the whole book would be like that, but instead most of it was like, here's a weird way to prepare your food for a party, which it's fun. It's a big like hardback.
Interesting. Yeah, I've never been super interested in Dali. I mean, I think he's the gateway drug for a lot of us getting into surrealism because he's probably the most famous surrealist. Mm-hmm. But in many ways is not the kind of surrealist that a lot of the other ones are. Like there's something very self-aggrandizing, kind of self-promoting about Dali that's...
Yeah, major narcissist. He would tell you that he's a narcissist and be proud of it.
Oh no, he loved Napoleon.
Yes, that's what I was saying about Hitler. Is he viewed him as like a character in an opera, being like grand, a quote unquote anti-hero, but like that's horrible to do to a person in reality when we consider what they're actually doing. It's one thing like in fiction, but no, Hitler's a person.
Yeah, well, I think Dali. It appears that he had a tenuous embrace of reality. I mean, like, I don't know if he's making it up. In his autobiography, you get the impression that he's making up a lot of it. It's an incredibly entertaining book. I would highly recommend reading it. He's a good writer. I think he's a better writer than a painter, personally.
Really?
In terms of the autobiography.
The autobiography, I bet he's very good at talking about himself.
Oh, yeah. It's him telling these absurd stories of his childhood with him like masturbating, poking melons hanging from the ceiling. I mean, just completely bonkers. He spends like one paragraph on the what's the name of the famous painting, Persistence of Memory.
Is that the one with the like people in the field?
With the one with the clocks, the melty clocks.
Oh, okay. No, there was a different painting that influenced him where they like turn into mantises in some of his works. But yeah, I remember the clocks as the impotence is the standard interpretation.
But sure. So he spends like a paragraph on that painting, which you'd like to hear more about that painting. And he spends several pages talking about being in a bathroom, trying to pick a booger off the wall that someone... It's a very funny book. But I mean, I think for me, Dali was less significant than like Max Ernst, who for me was really interesting. Miro was really interesting too. Those two.
Yeah. I got really into Dali's like paranoid critical method for a while.
Yeah, sure.
But yeah, a lot of his paintings, they're not automatic. And there's some sense in which they aren't like authentically like OG surreal. They're yeah,
they're very constructed paintings. I think surrealism at the end of the day is not so much a movement as a bunch of people who were kind of interested in roughly the same thing, who were around each other at the right time. And then Breton tries to make it a movement in pretty tyrannical ways at times. He's always trying to push it and force people to like be good surrealists. Which is funny, as anti-religious as he is, and how Pope-like in some ways his behavior is. But
yeah. So, what is it about Max Ernst exactly that you got so into?
For me, his paintings get to this space of the unconscious or the uncanny or something that is really potent, I think. There's just something about his paintings that kind of stick in your brain when you look at them. I think a lot, and they are often automatic. Like he was really interesting in doing rubbings and things like that.
Yeah.
And then turning the rubbings into these monsters or forests or landscapes or whatever it is, bringing in a lot of kind of symbolism, but in these kind of oblique ways that sort of defy interpretation. I think his collage novels are amazing. Like I come back to them all the time for inspiration.
Was he the one that did, what is it, like 7 days or something?
Yeah, it's something like that. I'm trying to remember. There's the girl of 100 heads.
Yeah, the 100 headed. I'm going to Google it right now.
Google
I read it every couple of years, but I think it's like 100 headed woman, maybe.
Yeah.
The 100 headless woman, and then it's usually packaged with like. It might be like.
I'm trying to remember what the other one is that you're talking about. It's called.
They're usually in the same book. If you buy the 100 headless woman.
Yeah, like the Dover edition.
But yeah, they heavily influenced Max my approach to AI art early on when, especially it was even more incoherent. Here it is. I'm going to say it horribly for anyone that knows French, but une semaine de bonté.
That sounds good.
A surrealistic novel in collage by Max Ernst. So he wrote this novel
a week of what is Bonte? Week of
I don't
something?
remember.
Week of I don't know.
But he was doing it in collage without drawing any of it himself, and it's mostly wordless, right?
I think it's entirely wordless, isn't it? Maybe I'm misremembering.
There are some like little like bits of words at the beginning of some sections,
of chapters or something.
Yeah, but you can identify who the characters are by like they'll have different animal heads or something.
That is correct. Yeah.
So if you are using like an AI model that is not able to maintain coherency, even though like the person with the bird head looks different every image, you know, okay, that's the bird head guy.
Yeah.
So it has some really interesting techniques for like communicating to making sure that the viewer or the reader, the listener understands roughly what's happening, like giving them at least a little thread, even though it never maintains coherence.
Yes. So it's this idea of there appears to be a character that is a character, but then the identity of that character is like constantly shifting and changing in this kind of Buñuel-like way where you're not really sure exactly who, you know, what the identity of this being. I mean, I think that for me is like something I try to do in my operas too, is there's not really characters per se in a lot of my pieces, but there is some kind of a through line where you can kind of latch on to something. Because for Abraxas, the main character I'm just calling the amphibian, and it's played by by a mezzo-soprano and a baritone, by two people. And I think who the amphibian is like constantly shifting, but you know it's always the amphibian because you always have these people on stage. So yeah. But yes, in terms of AI art, you know, like I don't know if you agree with this. I find AI art to be a lot more interesting when it's janky.
A little bit. When you're not trying to hide what your medium is, you can lean into what it actually does.
Right. I think that's where it becomes really interesting for me, is when it's janky and strange and kind of wrong.
Yeah, it can do a certain kind of uncanny that like would not occur to a human because it's not entirely made by one human anyways.
Right. Yeah.
Awesome. I don't know. My brain started going on tangents. There's a Buto performance I like by Sankai Yuku that is, let me make sure I'm saying the right one because I don't know Japanese, but it basically follows, my interpretation is it shows like the evolution of life from sea to land, including it like a noise music amphibian stage.
Ooh.
Meguri, or it's Meguri.
Okay.
And it does have similar themes. I don't know if you want to, anyone who, if you don't like Buto, maybe you don't want to watch it or whatever, but the subtitle in English is Teeming Sea, Tranquil Land, Exuberance Marine, Tranquility Terrestre. I guess it switches to French for a second at the end. But yeah, it had some, it's maybe more like, there's like, I don't know, when they emerge onto land, it's almost like intense, like arms thrown back, head towards the sky, like screaming almost. And then at the same time, you know that that like ancient Greek myth about like how humans used to have like 4 legs and 4 arms and like were split?
Yeah.
Okay. I didn't notice it directly in your Abraxas piece, but it was kind of bubbling around in the back of my mind.
Oh, I like that. No, I wasn't even thinking of that. That's Plato, isn't it?
I think that's where it first was. There's like a dialogue about the different types of love.
Is that Symposium, I think?
I read a lot of, I still have a giant hardback red version of like most of Plato's dialogues, but I could not tell you the names of which one or which.
Yeah, it's been a long time. I reread Timaeus about 4 months ago.
Which one's that?
It's so Timaeus is kind of the cosmological source book for the Middle Ages. A lot of what they thought about things comes from Timaeus. In Timaeus, he mentions the demiurge. He talks about the Platonic solids, like each of the elements is like its own geometric solid. It's so wrong. As a book of science, it's very bad. But it's really interesting just as a book of, if you don't really know what all these things are, that's what you come up with, and it's really ingenious in a lot of ways. It's really
It is.
interesting.
They were very smart people. They just didn't have the internet, right?
Well, they didn't have the scientific method. I think that's really what it comes down to. It doesn't seem to occur to them to test any of these ideas in any kind of way.
No, they kind of just argue about them.
They just kind of say it, and if it's rational, then it must come from God and it must be true. So that's all you need. Really.
If mathematics is your model of reality, and it kind of makes sense, right? If you think literally everything is math, that like you could just argue about things. There was one other. Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt. You can go ahead.
It's okay. Go ahead.
There was another thing I noticed in Paramecium, but you assigned COVID to the. I'm sorry, that's not the full title, but
whatever it is.
You assign COVID-19 to the Tower card. And I didn't notice reference to it, but it amused me that the standard Rider-Waite tarot card does have a crown on it, Corona, right?
Oh, does it?
Yeah, I have it on my phone, but yeah, the top of the tower on the most common deck, it's like a black sky, and there's a tower struck by a lightning bolt, and lots of little like divine sparks of light.
I don't remember the crown, but that's
there's a crown.
They knew. They knew.
Yeah.
That's interesting. No, what I was going to say about Plato was, I think they believed that the human was like a microcosm of the universe, basically, of the cosmos. And so there's this idea that the human mind is capable of perceiving the things of the cosmos just because it is, in fact, a microcosm of everything. So, like, if you can rationalize things, then they're true. If it's something that rationally makes sense, then it's true. It comes from God, which is an idea many of us don't have anymore.
Yeah. If you'll permit my mysticism for a moment, and I'm not claiming that this is what anyone in the past necessarily, or any specific people thought, but if we jump into like phenomenology for a second, the world, in quotes, is only ever what you experience, right? So there is a sense in which, in some mystical traditions, something that people might term God is really the like thing that is the aspect of non-experience that's like directly prior to experience, directly prior to the experience before it receives form, in quotes, like whatever it becomes perceived as. Like there's raw perception, and then something about awareness categorizes it as like the computer screen or the microphone. But then before all that, there is something in these traditions would postulate, there is something that's not a thing. The contradictory thing. I'm not saying that Abraxas is necessarily that, but
I would say that it is.
Okay.
There's a little line in the 15th, or rather 14th scene, the Sermon to the Dead scene in Abraxas. I had this idea that I've kind of played with for a long time of the great cosmic noise. So this idea of like the cosmic chaos that is without form until consciousness gives it form. And so it's kind of definitionally a monad. It's definitionally both everything and nothing kind of at the same time. And consciousness makes it dual. It makes it comprehensible, which I think is what you're saying, kind of. Am I right?
It depends a little bit on how you interpret some of those things. I don't know if you know anything about Kabbalah, but potentially some people would place what you just referred to as chaos depending on what you're actually imagining but cannot communicate. But your words, some people might attribute that to Binah, because that's where the outflowing of Chokmah, I don't know Hebrew, becomes receives its form over in Binah and then crosses down the abyss, if you're into that sort of thing.
Sure. Yeah, I'm not super fluent in the Tree of Life.
Some people, obviously there's disagreement, but some people would say that that's prior to that chaos, or at least what I'm referring to with your words, is like Pan, like an all outflowing. And then before the all outflowing is Keter, like the top of the tree, which is like a kind of nothing, but in a sense is still perceived as nothing. And then before the nothing that can be perceived as nothing, there's a neither nothing nor not thing.
Right.
Yeah, not thing is probably the better word than nothing.
Right.
So I don't know exactly what you were imagining or like your experience,
No, I mean,
but some people would
think,
parse it that way.
I think if you're dealing with that part of the tree of life, it becomes very confusing and ambiguous for me.
Yeah.
But I think that's sort of the nature of the subject. I mean,
Sure.
Kabbalah, of course, being heavily influenced by Neoplatonism and these kind of Platonic ideas, that also were a big influence on Gnosticism and these kinds of ideas. So, I mean, Gnosticism is essentially emanationist in a very similar way to Kabbalah.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I have loved our conversation. This has been great.
This has been great. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Is there anything that you'd like to plug before we go?
Sure. You can go to I would highly recommend going and checking out my opera. There is a video of it on my YouTube channel. The name of the piece is Tell Me a Bedtime Story, Abraxas. That's what we've been talking about when we say Abraxas this whole time. So you can watch that. There's also The Secret Life of the Paramecium, which is a song cycle about the major arcana and different microorganisms that I wrote a couple of years ago. That's also on my YouTube channel. So just type Brett Carson. I don't remember what the exact URL is or how YouTube even does that anymore.
There'll definitely be links in the description.
Oh, great. Okay. Well, you just click those. Also, my website, brettcarsonmusic.com, has some goodies on it. You could also go to my Bandcamp page, which is brettcarson.bandcamp.com. There's a lot, or not a lot. There's 3. I think they're pretty good. I think there's 4 albums you can listen to and download there. So I think that's it for me.
All right. Well, again, thank you for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you.